On the deck of the Creole, November 1841, the Atlantic wind howled against wooden planks, carrying with it the rattle of chains. Below, 134 men and women sat locked in darkness, condemned to the slave markets of New Orleans. Yet in that suffocating hold, one man rose, Madison Washington. When night descended, he and his comrades struck, seizing the ship and turning despair into defiance. Days later, 128 souls stepped onto foreign soil, not as cargo, but as free human beings. Madison Washington's life began, as so many others in Virginia did, beneath the weight of iron and tobacco leaves. He was born into bondage, his first breaths already entered into another man's ledger. The plantation where he toiled grew tobacco, its fields stretching in endless green rows beneath the summer sun. For young Madison, each row was a corridor, each season a cruel reminder that his body was not his own. Yet even in those fields, freedom whispered. He listened to the elders' stories, tales of rivers crossed, of lands where no voices could be silenced. To many, these stories were nothing but dreams meant to soften the ache of chains. But to Madison, they were promises. He grew into a tall, lean man, known for his strength, but remembered most for his unshakable resolve. Behind quiet eyes lived a storm, and in that storm, the memory of wings. When he finally escaped, it was as though the storm had burst. He ran northward, each step an act of rebellion, each night under the stars a prayer whispered into the dark. Against all odds, Madison crossed into Canada. There he tasted freedom, not as a dream, but as reality. No overseer's whip cracked above him. No market weighed his worth. He worked, he earned. He breathed air that belonged to no master. But freedom for one man was not enough. Madison's heart remained tethered to his wife, still bound in Virginia's soil. The dream of liberty was hollow without her. And so, the man who had touched the sky chose to descend once more into the cage. He returned south, risking everything for love. The price was heavy. Captured again, Madison was dragged back into the world of shackles. His flight to freedom became a story whispered in chains, proof of what was possible, but also a warning of what awaited those who tried. He was like a bird who had once felt the wind, who had once seen the horizon without bars. To be forced back into the cage was worse than never having flown at all. And yet the fire in Madison's chest did not die. It smoldered, waiting for the moment when despair would once again give way to defiance. The Creole was not a ship built for people. It was a vessel for profit. In November of 1841, 134 enslaved men and women were forced aboard, bound for the slave markets of New Orleans. Their bodies were shackled, wrists bruised, ankles rubbed raw against iron. The hold of the ship reeked of rust and sweat, of fear pressed deep into wood. Above deck, the sea stretched wide and merciless, each wave a brutal reminder that escape was impossible. Among them sat Madison Washington, his body confined but his mind unbroken. Through the small grates carved into the wooden walls, he gazed at the horizon. To the sailors, the ocean was a road to trade. To Madison, it was something else entirely, the embodiment of freedom, vast, blue, unreachable. He could see liberty, but it remained a world away, just beyond the reach of the chains on his wrists. The days blurred. Into one another, the days bled, each marked by the same routines: rations of stale bread, the thud of boots above, the clank of chains whenever a body shifted in discomfort. In that suffocating darkness, time seemed suspended, as though the ship itself drifted not only between ports, but between life and death. The merchants saw them as cargo, numbers to be tallied, investments to yield profit in the squares of New Orleans. Yet the human spirit has a way of refusing such mathematics. Every whispered prayer, every glance exchanged between captives, became rebellion in its own quiet form. Madison, his back pressed against the creaking hull, began to shape silence into resolve. He had escaped once before. He knew the taste of free air. That memory became a flame, faint but unyielding, pushing back the crushing dark. The ocean mocked him, yes, but it also called to him. The endless horizon seemed to whisper, "Chains are not destiny." As the ship pitched and groaned, Madison studied the rhythms of the sailors, the fatigue in the guards, the moments when vigilance slipped. He knew freedom would not be offered. It would have to be taken. While others lay in despair, Madison's mind stirred. Within him grew the knowledge that the voyage of the Creole would not end as the merchants expected. Something would break before the journey was done, whether it was the chains or the men forced to wear them. The lower deck of the Creole was a world of shadows. Lanterns flickered weakly, casting trembling halos of light that deepened the surrounding gloom. Chains rattled whenever someone shifted, and the smell of damp wood mingled with sweat and fear. To most, it was a place of silence, a dungeon adrift upon waves. But in that silence, voices began to rise. Not loudly, but in whispers, thin threads of hope woven between the clinks of iron. It was Madison Washington who started them. His voice, steady though hushed, carried across the gloom. He leaned close to one man, then another, his words like sparks catching in dry grass. He spoke of timing, waiting for the night when the guards would tire, when vigilance would falter. He spoke of courage, of reclaiming what chains had stolen. Some listened in terror, shaking their heads. To speak of revolt was to invite death, yet others leaned closer, their eyes glinting in the dimness, drawn by the conviction in Madison's tone. He did not speak as a dreamer, but as a man who had once breathed free air. He told them, "We may not all live to see it, but we must not die in silence. Better to rise and fall as men than to sink forever as cargo." The plan took shape in fragments. One man would watch the guards. Another would conceal whatever could be fashioned into a weapon. Iron bolts loosened from the hull. Fragments of wood, sharp enough to cut. They would move as one, not as 134 individuals, but as a single body aching for freedom. In those hours of plotting, something shifted. The air in the hold no longer belonged to despair alone. It thickened with anticipation, with the fragile electricity of people daring to imagine a different fate. Chains still bound their wrists, but the idea of liberty began to loosen the heaviest shackles of all, the ones around the spirit. The whispers became their covenant. Every glance, every nod in the darkness was a promise. They would not meet their end in the slave markets of New Orleans. If death came, it would come on their terms. If freedom could be claimed, they would seize it with both hands. They would seize it, grasping freedom with every ounce of strength left in their bodies. For the first time since boarding the Creole, Madison felt the air shift. It was as though the ship itself sensed the storm gathering below its deck. Above, the ocean roared in endless waves. Below, another tide was forming. A tide of men who had decided that the night would no longer belong to despair, but to defiance, the 7th of November, 1841. The night was heavy with salt and silence. Above deck, sailors moved in weary rhythm, their boots thudding against the planks, their voices muffled by the wind. Below, the captives lay as if defeated, but their eyes remained awake. They had counted the hours. The moment had arrived. Madison Washington rose from the shadows, his figure tall even in confinement. He gave no rousing speech, no declaration, only a nod. And like a match struck in darkness, the revolt began. A sudden clatter rang out as chains fell away, iron striking wood like the tolling of a bell. Men surged forward, fists clutching makeshift weapons. In the cramped space of the ship, chaos erupted. A merchant fell, cries split the night. Sailors scrambled in confusion. The sounds were not of battle in open fields, but of desperation compressed into planks and timbers. Shouts tangled with the crack of wood, the scrape of iron, the gasps of men caught in fury. Then, abruptly, silence. Only the slap of waves against the hull remained. On deck, the sailors who survived were forced into submission. Some lay wounded, others bound. The revolt had not been bloodless, but it had been swift, decisive. The ship once destined for New Orleans was no longer in the hands of traitors. It now belonged to those who had been chained in its hold. For Madison Washington, the moment was not triumph, but resolve. His chest heaved, sweat mingled with salt air, but his voice was steady. This ship no longer belongs to despair. It belongs to us. The men and women looked to him, not as a master, but as a beacon. In his stance, in his unshaken eyes, they saw proof that hope could be made flesh. The spark had been lit. Now they had to keep the fire alive. Above them, the stars wheeled across the sky, silent witnesses to the mutiny below. In the quiet that followed, every heartbeat carried the same unspoken truth. The voyage of the Creole had changed course forever. The ship creaked as its timbers adjusted to new command. The rebellion had taken the vessel, but now came the question, where would it go? The stars stretched infinite above, the ocean unbroken on every side. Freedom could not simply be declared, it had to be navigated. The surviving sailors stood trembling, their hands bound, their eyes darting between Madison Washington and the restless captives now crowding the deck. They knew the sea, they knew the currents, but they no longer held the power to choose the ship's fate. Under orders from Washington and his allies, the bow turned eastward, away from New Orleans, away from the markets, toward the unknown. The wheel groaned as it shifted, wood grinding against wood, rope straining against rope. For those who watched, it was not merely a change in direction. It was the axis of destiny itself turning. The flag of the United States still rippled overhead, a reminder of the power that claimed them as property. Yet beneath that flag, a new nation of sorts was being born. A nation not defined by borders, but by defiance. The men and women gathered close, whispering. Prayers rose softly, captives clinging to one another as the ship adjusted its course. Some wept openly, others closed their eyes, as though in that stillness they could already see the shore waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. But fear lingered. The ocean was no ally. Storms could rise without warning. Naval ships might appear and drag them back into chains. Even the subdued sailors, bound and beaten, could yet betray them with false bearings. Every moment balanced on the knife's edge between trust and terror. Madison stood at the stern, his gaze fixed on the dark line where water met sky. He had known the cage of the plantation. He had known the fleeting taste of freedom. Now he stood between those two worlds, not yet free, but no longer a slave. The wheel turning beneath the sailors' hands was more than wood and rope. It was history itself being forced into a new direction. Madison whispered to himself, "We did not seize this ship to lose our way. We will see land. We will see freedom." And so the Creole, once bound for New Orleans, sailed instead into uncharted destiny. Its sails filled with wind, its keel cut through waves, and its passengers, no longer silent cargo, stood together as witnesses to the moment when captivity bent, if only briefly, to the will of those it had sought to destroy. The Atlantic answered their defiance with fury. Waves rose high, slamming against the hull like fists. The sky blackened with storm clouds. Rain poured in torrents, soaking the deck, erasing the line between ocean and sky. The Creole shuddered with every strike of the sea, as though the waters themselves sought to reclaim the vessel and the fragile hope it carried. Fear rippled among the freed men and women. The chained sailors muttered warnings, reefs, currents, death in every wrong turn. Some captives clung to the mast, others huddled in prayer, their voices drowned by thunder. Through it all, Madison Washington stood firm. The storm tested not only the ship, but the resolve of those who had seized it. He moved among his companions, gripping shoulders, steadying trembling hands. His words, shouted over the wind, carried calm authority. "We have begun. We cannot go back." Each wave that crashed upon the deck was more than water. It was doubt, fear, despair seeking to drag them under. Yet with every surge, Madison's determination grew stronger. He reminded them, storms pass, but chains endure forever. If they surrendered now, their fate would be sealed in iron. If they endured, the horizon might yet hold freedom. The storm raged for hours, perhaps longer. Time dissolved in the roar of wind and water. But as dawn approached, the clouds began to part. Light returned, thin and gray, spilling across faces drawn with exhaustion but not defeat. The Creole, battered but afloat, had survived. So had they. What the storm revealed was more than the ship's endurance. It revealed the unbroken core of those aboard. Fear had threatened to scatter them, but resolve bound them tighter than chains ever had. They were no longer passengers on a stolen ship. They had become a people, carried forward by one unyielding belief that freedom was worth every peril. After days that stretched like years, the horizon finally shifted. At first, it was only a smudge, a darker shadow against endless blue. Then, as the Creole drew nearer, the smudge grew into shape. Land. The Bahamas. For the 134 souls who had boarded in chains, that sight was more than geography. It was salvation carved against the sky. The word passed among them like a current, land. Some fell to their knees, hands clasped in trembling prayer. Others pressed close to the railing, eyes wide, tears cutting through the salt on their cheeks. Children clutched their mothers, too young to grasp politics or law, yet old enough to feel that something monumental was unfolding. To Madison Washington, the sight struck deeper than words could capture. He knew the Bahamas were under British rule. He knew Britain had abolished slavery in 1834. That shoreline was not an idea, it was freedom made flesh. It meant the gamble of mutiny might yield more than a violent end. The sailors, still bound, exchanged uneasy glances. They too understood what Nassau represented. If the captives set foot there, American law could not claim them. Above, the United States flag snapped in the wind, its stars and stripes both a warning and a memory of the world they had defied. Yet beneath it, a new current surged, hope undeniable, alive. As the ship crept closer, the turquoise water shimmered beneath the sun. Palm trees lined the distant shore, their green leaves swaying as though in welcome for those who had known nothing but fields and chains. The sight was almost unbearable in its beauty, yet fear did not vanish. What if Britain yielded to American demands? What if the law bent back toward chains? Freedom lingered just beyond the waves, waiting to be claimed or denied. Still, for the first time since being forced onto the Creole, the future felt possible. Not guaranteed, not safe, but possible. Madison whispered to those nearest him, "Look, there is the horizon we dreamed of. Whatever comes, we have reached this far. Hold it in your heart." And so they sailed into Nassau Harbor, their ship heavy with history, their faces lit by the fragile, burning hope the horizon promised. Nassau was no ordinary port. It was a crossroads of empires, a place where American merchants traded, British officials ruled, and ships from every corner of the Atlantic passed through. When the Creole dropped anchor, the rebellion it carried became more than an act of defiance. It became a question of law that would echo far beyond the Bahamas. American representatives demanded their property be returned. To them, the 134 men and women were cargo, stolen goods to be restored. They argued with the weight of American law, with treaties and threats, insisting Nassau had no right to interfere. But the British colonial government held firm. Since 1834, slavery had been abolished throughout the empire. On British soil, no person could be owned. And so the officials declared, "Here, there are no slaves. Here, they are free." The courtroom in Nassau brimmed with tension. Sailors testified, merchants pleaded. Captives stood silent, their lives balanced on the edge of words. The law itself seemed to tremble, stretched between nations, between profit and principle. In the end, 128 captives were granted freedom. Only those accused of bloodshed were held for further consideration. The rest were released, their chains struck off, their names no longer counted as inventory. The decision ignited outrage in the United States. Newspapers decried British interference. Slaveholders fumed at the loss of their investment. But in Nassau, on that day, justice bent toward freedom. For Madison Washington, it was vindication. The revolt had not been in vain. The whispers in the dark. The storm endured. The blood spilled. All of it had led to this, a court acknowledging their humanity. When the ruling was read, the room seemed to exhale. The captives, now free, embraced one another, their tears no longer of despair but of release. For the first time, the word freedom was not a dream spoken in chains. It was a fact carved into law. The Creole Mutiny had moved from ship to shore, from violence to verdict, and history, once indifferent, had been forced to listen. The air in Nassau carried a weight unlike any they had ever breathed. It was thick with heat, with salt, and with the voices of people who walked freely along the docks. For the 128 captives released, stepping onto that soil was like crossing an invisible threshold between nightmare and dawn. One by one, they descended from the Creole. Their feet touched ground not as property, but as people. Some dropped to their knees, pressing their hands into the earth as though to confirm it was real. Others lifted their faces to the sky, lips moving in prayers long denied but never forgotten. Madison Washington stood among them, his shoulders broad, his eyes steady. He was not a king nor a general, but in that moment he carried the aura of both. The men and women gathered around him instinctively, as though his presence alone anchored the fragile reality of their freedom. There were tears, tears of exhaustion, of grief for what had been lost, and of gratitude for what had been gained. The sound of waves against the harbor mingled with the sobs, forming a hymn of release, written not in notes but in breath. Children clung to their mothers, too young to understand the intricacies of law and nations, but old enough to recognize that the world had shifted. They no longer saw chains on their parents' wrists. They no longer felt the iron weight of ownership. For the first time, they belonged only to themselves. Washington said little. His words had already been spoken, in whispers and shouts, in the silent defiance of action. Now his silence itself was eloquent. He simply looked toward the horizon, as though searching for something beyond even this hard-won victory. But his figure, standing firm amid the freed, became a symbol. In him they saw the embodiment of a truth long denied, that liberty is not a gift to be granted, but a right to be claimed. The docks of Nassau had seen countless ships, countless arrivals and departures. But on that day, when 128 souls walked into the sunlight as free people, the harbor became more than a port. It became a stage where history declared itself quietly, solemnly, unmistakably. And for those who lived it, that moment would echo in their hearts forever. The Creole Mutiny remains one of the most extraordinary and least remembered acts of defiance in American history. Unlike so many revolts that ended in blood and chains, this one ended in freedom. 128 men and women stepping onto British soil as human beings, no longer cargo. Yet history has a way of silencing inconvenient victories. Madison Washington's name does not thunder across textbooks. The Creole is not spoken of with the same weight as battles or treaties. For many, the story slipped into the shadows, carried only in fragments, in whispers, in the margins of memory, and yet its meaning endures. The mutiny exposed the fault lines of nations, America clinging to slavery, Britain committed to abolition. It forced the world to reckon, if only briefly, with the question of whether law could deny what humanity made clear. For Washington himself, the mutiny was never about headlines or glory. It was about a principle larger than his own life, that freedom is worth the risk of everything. He had escaped once, been captured, endured chains again, and still he rose. His resolve turned a ship meant to deliver bodies into a vessel of liberation. The legacy of that act lies not only in its outcome, but in the question it asks of us still: who defines a man? Is it the law that calls him property? Or is it history which sees him as a liberator? The Creole Mutiny whispers through time. urging us to remember that freedom has always been won by those willing to stand in defiance, even when the odds weigh like iron. And so we return to Madison Washington, a man born in chains who dared to dream beyond them. His story is not simply one of rebellion. It is one of love for his wife, for his people, for the unyielding belief that no human being was ever meant to live as cargo.